In 1958, the Vice President of the United States was nearly beaten to death by a mob in Caracas. The windows of his limousine were smashed with lead pipes. His wife was spat on. And yet, the relationship between the two countries didn't just survive. It flourished. The reason why explains everything about what's happening now. Richard Nixon was supposed to be on a goodwill tour. Latin America was restless. Communism was spreading. And Washington needed to remind the hemisphere who their friends were. Venezuela was the final stop, the crown jewel of American influence in South America. It should have been a celebration. Instead, Nixon's motorcade was ambushed in the heart of Caracas. A mob surrounded his limousine, rocking it back and forth, trying to flip it over. Secret Service agents drew their weapons. Nixon later wrote that, for a moment, he genuinely believed he was about to die. Back in Washington, Eisenhower scrambled 10,000 troops. Marines and airborne infantry were positioned in Puerto Rico and Cuba, waiting for the order to invade. The United States was prepared to go to war, to rescue its vice president from a country that was supposedly an ally. Nixon escaped, the Venezuelan military apologized, and here's the part that seems insane from a modern perspective. The relationship didn't just survive, it deepened. Within months, American oil money was flowing into Caracas faster than ever. Within years, Nixon himself, now president, was selling advanced fighter jets to Venezuela. The same country that nearly killed him became one of America's most reliable partners. Why? Because Venezuela had something America needed more than pride. It had oil, and not just any oil. It had the specific type of heavy crude that American refineries were built to process. To understand the current crisis, you have to understand this original bargain. The United States didn't care about democracy in Venezuela. It didn't care about human rights. It cared about one thing, keeping the oil flowing north. The relationship between American oil companies and Venezuela goes back over a century. By the 1950s, American giants like Exxon and Mobil had built an empire beneath Venezuelan soil. They brought the technology, they brought the capital, and they took most of the profits. For decades, this arrangement worked because both sides benefited. Venezuela got roads, refineries, and a middle class. America got cheap, reliable energy, just a short tanker ride from Texas. The Cold War made the partnership even tighter. With Castro rising in Cuba, Washington needed Venezuela stable and friendly at any cost. But every colonial arrangement carries the seeds of its own destruction. And in Venezuela, those seeds were planted in 1976. That year, President Carlos Andres Perez did something that would have triggered an invasion in other countries. He nationalized the entire oil industry. Every well, every pipeline, every refinery that American companies had built became the property of the Venezuelan state. But here's what makes 1976 different from what came later. Perez didn't steal anything, he bought it. Venezuela paid fair market value for every asset. They issued bonds, they wrote checks. The American executives went home with their pockets full and their dignity intact. More importantly, Venezuela kept the Americans around. The new state oil company, PDVSA, hired the same engineers, used the same technology, and maintained the same relationships. The oil kept flowing. The only thing that changed was the name on the letterhead. For 20 years, this worked beautifully. PDVSA became one of the most professional oil companies in the world. It operated like a private corporation, not a government ministry. Venezuelan crude filled American refineries. American dollars filled Venezuelan banks. Everyone was happy. Everyone except the Venezuelan people who weren't invited to the party. Because while PDVSA executives lived like kings, most Venezuelans lived in poverty. The oil wealth created a bubble of luxury floating above an ocean of misery. And in a democracy, that's not sustainable. In 1998, the misery found a voice. His name was Hugo Chavez. Chavez wasn't a politician. He was a former military officer who had attempted a coup 6 years earlier. He failed and went to prison. But his televised surrender speech made him a folk hero. When he ran for president, he won in a landslide. Chavez looked at the books and saw something that infuriated him. Under agreements signed in the 1990s, foreign oil companies were paying almost nothing in taxes. Accounting tricks and sweetheart deals had turned Venezuela's greatest asset into a giveaway. In 2001, Chavez passed a new hydrocarbon law. Royalties jumped to 30%. The state demanded majority ownership of all oil projects. Foreign companies could still operate, but they would no longer write their own rules. The reaction from Venezuela's elite was immediate and violent. In April 2002, a coalition of business leaders, military officers, and oil executives launched a coup. Chavez was arrested. A businessman was installed as president. The United States recognized the new government within hours. The coup lasted exactly 47 hours. Loyal military units, backed by massive street protests, reversed the takeover. Chavez returned to the presidential palace, shaken but alive. And he had learned a crucial lesson. The United States and the oil companies weren't just business partners. They were existential threats. What followed was a purge. Chavez fired 18,000 PDVSA employees, gutting the company's expertise but eliminating its political opposition. Then he turned to the foreign companies and delivered an ultimatum. Accept the new terms or leave. Most companies signed Chevron, Total, Repsol. They calculated that Venezuelan oil was too valuable to abandon, even under worse terms. But two American giants refused. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips walked away. Chavez responded by seizing their assets. Billions of dollars worth of infrastructure in the Orinoco Belt, the largest oil deposit on Earth, became Venezuelan state property overnight. This is the moment that echoes into the present. This is what American politicians mean when they talk about theft. The expropriations triggered lawsuits that dragged through international courts for over a decade. Venezuela was ordered to pay billions in compensation. It never did, but Chavez had a plan. If the Americans wouldn't do business with him, he would find new partners. China offered $60 billion in loans to be repaid in oil. Russia's Rosneft bought massive stakes in Venezuelan fields. The Orinoco Belt, which American companies had developed, was now financing America's rivals. This is where the strategic panic in Washington began. It was no longer about Exxon's balance sheet. It was about the Monroe Doctrine. The principle that the Western Hemisphere belongs to America was being shredded. Chinese money was flowing into the largest oil reserves on the planet, 3 hours from Miami. When Chavez died in 2013, his successor, Nicolas Maduro, inherited a system that was already crumbling. Oil prices collapsed in 2014. The loans came due. The economy imploded. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency. Millions fled the country. But even as Venezuela starved, it sat on a prize that the United States desperately needed. Here's the technical detail that most people miss. The massive refineries on the U.S. Gulf Coast, in Texas and Louisiana, were specifically engineered to process heavy crude oil. For decades, they ran on Venezuelan oil. When sanctions cut off that supply, they had to buy heavy crude from Russia. And when the Ukraine war made that impossible, they were left scrambling. The United States doesn't just want Venezuelan oil. Its industrial infrastructure requires it. This is the uncomfortable math beneath the rhetoric. Every statement about democracy, every sanction justified by human rights, exists alongside a simple material reality. America built refineries for Venezuelan crude, and now those refineries are hungry. The irony is almost too perfect. In 1976, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry and paid for every asset. America accepted it because the oil kept flowing. In 2007, Venezuela nationalized again, this time without payment. America called it theft. But the real crime, the unforgivable one, wasn't the seizure of property. It was the decision to sell that oil to China instead of Texas. Today, Venezuela remains locked in a standoff with no clear resolution. The country is broken, but it refuses to surrender. The United States has leverage, but not enough to force a collapse. China holds billions in debt that may never be repaid. Russia has invested in fields that may never produce at full capacity. And beneath all of it, the Orinoco Belt sits waiting. More recoverable oil than Saudi Arabia, enough to fuel the American economy for generations, just out of reach. The relationship that survived Nixon's near lynching couldn't survive a change in terms. The partnership that flourished through coups and dictators collapsed when the profits stopped flowing north. This was never about democracy. It was never about human rights. It was about the same thing it's always been about. Who controls the oil and who gets paid? The question now is simple. How far is the United States willing to go to get it back? And what will be left of Venezuela when they do? The answer is being written right now. In sanctions and counter-sanctions, in diplomatic cables and military exercises, in the quiet desperation of a nation that has the world's greatest treasure and can't afford to eat. Nixon survived Caracas because Venezuela had oil. Chavez survived the coup because he controlled that oil. Maduro survives today because the oil is still in the ground. But survival is not victory. And the siege, whether by sanctions or ships, is just beginning.